Hello and welcome to Dialogue. Russian artillery and missiles have struck Ukrainian military fortifications in the beginning of what Russian President Vladimir Putin has called a special military operation in eastern Ukraine. The military operation was soon followed by sanctions and condemnations from Western countries. What is the situation on the ground right now, and why the sudden move by Russia? And what is the targeted result of the military operation? To take a closer look at what's going on in Ukraine, I'm glad to be joined by Victor Gao-Zhikai, Chair Professor of Suzhou University, Michele Geraci, former Undersecretary of State of Ministry of Economic Development of Italy, Andy Mock, Senior Research Fellow at the Center for China and Globalization, and later by Dmitry Alexander Symes, journalist. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Victor, I will start with you. If you look at the quick development over the past 24 hours, are you surprised?
I'm surprised because a flurry of diplomatic activities took place before today, and there was still hope that dialogue and negotiation and diplomacy may eventually prevail, preventing a war from happening. What happened today was really very, very momentous in a sense and carries great historical significance. I think Russian forces are not only launching attacks in the eastern part of Ukraine, but in quite a few other places, seemingly surrounding Ukraine from 3 sides, if not 4 sides, and there is no indication as to they will stop the operations anytime soon. So I think this sends the whole world into jittery, and this probably will be a landmark event in the post-Second World War history in Europe and for mankind as a whole.
Mm-hmm. Well, Michele, we know that back in December, a couple of months ago, there was this diplomacy, the negotiations between Russia, NATO, Russia, the United States, OSCE. Russia has made it very clear that is a written guarantee for no Ukraine NATO membership, basically. So why all of a sudden, we reached such a stage? What happened?
I think, as always, the answer is in the history. I think President Putin has, in a way, built up a kind of anxiety and anger against the NATO expansion to the east. Now, there are debates whether that was promised not to be the case by Secretary of State Baker in 1990 when he met with Gorbachev. But the fact is that beyond formal agreement, the Russians, and I know for a fact, they look at the map of the world, not the way we look at it with the US on the left, Europe in the middle, and Asia. They look at it from the Arctic point of view. So they have a projection from the Arctic Sea. And if you look at it from there, you see Canada, US, and then the rest of Europe, and then going down with the Middle East, and then up Philippines, Korea, Guam, Japan. They feel they are surrounded by NATO or American military presence. And so from the point of view of the Russians, they feel encircled. And every time there is the possibility of a new member to join the NATO, like in the case of Ukraine, and let's not forget, we don't talk a lot about it, about Georgia, who's the next in line. He feels, this is Vladimir Putin, he feels that the world is closing in into Russia. So this morning he said this is an existential threat for Russia. Mm-hmm. So I think after frustrating for 20, 30 years, not himself because he's not been in power for 30 years, but he has learned the history of previous engagements and he has seen no results from the NATO, he felt that he needed to take action because he thinks that NATO has crossed a red line. Again, this is not what I think. I'm telling you what I know and what I analyze. Yes. They do think.
That's right. Andy, Michele told us some of the historical background of what the Russians are thinking in terms of their relationship with NATO and the West in general. But if you look at the West, the NATO eastward expansion, 5 wave of expansion, of course, and then that was not everybody, agreeing with the expansion, even inside the West. For example, back in 1997, George Kennan, he wrote a piece basically said that's a fatal error because Russia will feel threatened and they will do something to oppose such a move. And then in 2014, Kissinger penned a piece on New York Times. He basically said something similar. He said that if Ukraine was siding with the West or the Russians, there will be probably a problem. Basically, this country has to remain neutral. Otherwise, there will be a renewed Cold War. And now what we are seeing is really a hot war here.
No, Ting-Do, I absolutely agree. And I think here that while we may be surprised by the details, and certainly I think it would be very difficult to predict the actual time, the event of this happening, I think, certainly is inevitable. And as you mentioned, from George Kennan to Henry Kissinger, I think what this shows is a colossal failure on the part of the United States and certain countries in Western Europe to respect one's interlocutors and recognize that when you threaten someone, even though there might not be an immediate reaction, just the stress of that, sooner or later, it's human nature to react. And I would add a little bit of historical context as well, that we look at from France under Napoleon to Germany under Hitler. Russia certainly has very legitimate security concerns. And I think this also stems from a certain narcissism in the West that really can't conceive of interest and concerns that are not their own. And really, this is just such a colossal failure on the part of the West, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, Victor, obviously, interestingly, I think it's a press conference by the White House. Basically, the White House is calling China. They say, this is China's obligation to convince Russia to back down. And of course, Chinese spokesperson of the Foreign Ministry mentioned about, there's no need for U.S. to lecture us what we can do or what we should do or how to understand the territorial integrity and national sovereignty, because China is very sensitive to that too. She also mentioned about the bombing of a Chinese embassy in Yugoslavia in the 1990s. What do you make of that?
Well, first of all, the United States to lecture China as to what China need to do in dealing with a very important strategic partner like Russia is completely misguided. China knows very well how we need to deal with Russia. We are very close. We have very close relations. We are not allies, but better than allies, stronger than allies. And therefore, it is completely inappropriate for the United States to try to impose anything on top of China as to what China needs to do vis-a-vis Russia. Now, the second point is very important. I think the United States and its attempt to recruit Ukraine into NATO is very much to be blamed for this outbreak of the war. Now, the United Nations and many other countries are condemning Russia as if Russia is completely at fault. However, if we trace to the origin of this crisis, I think Russia has said many, many years, including President Putin himself, that Ukraine should not become a NATO member. Now Russia has demonstrated with act of war that over my dead body if Ukraine becomes a NATO member. So I hope countries like the United States and NATO members really need to heed as to what President Putin has in his mind, what Russia really is concerned. I think for Ukraine to become a permanent neutral country will be a very good solution out of this mess.
We will see, like how diplomacy work probably. And Michele, you mentioned about, previously about the Russian thinking, the history, probably, obviously legitimate concern of the Russian, their national security concern. The U.S. like to talk about the great power competition. If you talk great power competition like Russia, China, the United States, European Union, the great powers, they should be respected in terms of their core interests. The Russian has made it very clear about no Ukraine NATO ship. Why is it so difficult for if you look back now, the U.S. said made it very clear they will not send the troops to protect the Ukraine, and at the same time they will not grant the Russian request of no NATO membership for Ukraine. So what is the idea of the West? What is behind this decision? The rationale.
The overriding principle on which we base our thinking is basically the freedom of every country, every people to choose for themselves what they want to do. And I think this is a kind of universal principle that I think China also believes in. So the NATO approach is, well, if Ukraine wants to join the NATO, so it should. It is not up to the Russia to say no. It is not up to China to say anything, not to European. It's up to only the Ukrainian people. Now, this principle, like all principle, is nice when it does not cross certain boundaries. And the thing I was mentioning before, for Russia, this principle is impairing their security. Now, there is an additional reason that Ukraine is not just a country, it's a country together with the Belarus that the Russian feels very close to it. When the Soviet Union broke up, we have many countries like Kazakhstan and many states in Central Asia and even the Baltic state that have a slightly different affinity to Russia. But Belarus and Ukraine is almost like sister countries. So I think Russia does accept that Estonia and other countries can take a little bit of a pro-European view. They join the EU and even some NATO membership, but they cannot accept that the closest sister in the relationship, like Belarus and Ukraine, turn on the other side. And this is the point. It's also a matter of political philosophy, if you want. Some countries, it's okay that the principle stands of self-choice by the people, but countries that do that, they also need to be aware that this may have some side effect of consequences. So the principle cannot be taken to extremes, because when we get to extremes, then we have, like in this case, extremes forces that react, almost Newtonian.